Welcome to Mental Health, It's a Trap. We're your hosts, Susan and Stephen, mother and son, unravel the complexities of the mental health traps people fall in. Join us on this podcast journey as we demystify the mental health labyrinth, explore common issues, and provide you with tools to navigate this sometimes extremely daunting terrain. You can expect engaging conversations, personal stories, and probably also have a laugh or two. Access to mental health care should not be what causes you additional stress. We invite you to follow along and we can embrace the darkness together.
Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about grief and loss, about our experiences. We are going to share resources. We are going to talk about the compassionate friends. We are going to also talk about beliefs and attitudes around grief and share a mix of both our personal and professional experience working in grief and loss, and going back to talking about the Compassionate Friends. They recently just had their, I believe, 47th national conference in July, and usually it will be always in the month of July. And it's a space where people get to connect with other people who are grieving, who are parents who lost a child, siblings who lost the sibling, or grandparents who lost a grandchild. And sometimes people are even a mix who are a grieving parent, sibling, and grandparent, or a grieving sibling and a grieving parent. And so sometimes there's a mix in between there.
Yes, so we did go to the conference this year, and it's been my first in a number of years. I used to go to them annually and just found myself in a different space in my own grief journey. And so just really went to hang out with Stephen and, maybe connect with some people that I met in the past at the conferences. So yeah, it was a good experience, and really liked Stephen's healing group. So that was great to attend that and to bear witness to what that experience was like for others. So yeah, I think overall it was good, and got to hang out with some siblings and parents and even grandparents and have dinners and attend events and stuff. So it was good for me.
Yeah, I think it's a common misconception, right? Like, oh, you're going to a grief conference? Oh no, that sounds so horrible. It's like, well, what's worse is that people died, right? It's like there's nothing, once you experience someone die in your life, there's nothing that really compares, right? Because it's like a part of the healing where that's where we go for healing. And then as we kind of touch on beliefs and attitudes, how that frames how people view grief. Like, grief is this ugly, nasty thing. Is it? Sometimes, but not always. And if we always have this narrative of like, grief is bad, ugly, get over it, push through it, go back to your old self, that kind of reinforces like a negative stereotype on grieving. And so people struggle grieving because society is telling them not to and to get over it. People are telling them not to grieve and get over it. And then they're telling themselves. So it's almost like three parts where it's grieving is natural, but we have these three almost entities, thoughts or expectations that keep us from being able to do that.
Right. And I think that people, as we reinforce and ingrain those messages in people and not allow people to express their grief in healthy ways, right? So we tend to end up seeing in the grieving process people becoming more depressed and more anxious and more isolated, because the messages that we receive are telling us, you have 3 days off from work to do your wake and funeral or whatever your belief system or rituals or religion is, right? So you have this process, and we give you 3 days from work. And I think that sets a tone in the brain of, I have 3 days to grieve, and once I'm done, I need to move on, right? And I know personally for me and my own experience of losing Stacy, it wasn't something I was going to get over ever in my entire life. That I know now more so than I did earlier in my grief, because of the messages that I knew of growing up. We didn't talk about grief and loss. And my sister lost her infant daughter at 3 months old at a very young age, many, many years prior to Stacy, and no one ever talked about her. And then when Stacy died, she had the opportunity to finally grieve in a healthy way her own child. Don't talk about it. You can have more kids, move on, like whatever the messages are. And there are many, many different messages that people get about how to grieve. And I have worked in the grief world, and I work in the therapy world where there is a lot of grief. And I tell people, you grieve in whatever way you need to. As long as you're not hurting yourself or anyone else, it doesn't matter. It's not other people's job to tell you how to grieve. It's a journey, it's a process, and it's not something you just get over. And I know in the grief world, and this drove me nuts as I was attending groups early on in Compassionate Friends, the new normal. Who came up with that? I'm just going to say that out loud. It is, to me, I say, well, please define what normal is, right? So normal is really a perspective of each individual, what their normal is. I've always phrased it as learning how to live life with the loss versus a new normal, right? Because what does that really mean? And that sounds like a one-size-fits-all to me kind of thing when it hits my brain. So I think it's really important for people to know that it's okay to talk about your grief. It's okay to feel it and do you, whatever that is. And you might have to try new things or do different traditions or switch up traditions, whatever that stuff looks like. And it's okay, right? It's okay. I remember many, many years ago, a parent lost an infant. That loss is hard in its own right in many different ways because they've lost their present and their future, right? The child didn't grow up, and so they don't have the memories and whatnot. And this mom saved her infant's diaper. And a lot of people were very judgmental about that. Like, that's disgusting. How can you do that? Listen, if that's the only material thing that she has of her child, who cares? It's not living in your house. What do you care? Don't comment on it, right? And I think and then we don't talk about grief, and we just, how you doing? We just automatically say, fine, okay. It's just the automatic responses, because that's really what people want to hear. They don't want to hear, I had a really rough day. I remember early on when I went to work and my boss would say to me, are you okay? And I'd say, I'm having a Stacy day. And she'd go, okay, do you want to go home? Do you want to stay? Like, what do you need? And she was great. She was one of my favorite bosses of all time and very supportive. So yeah, I think we need to be aware of our own belief systems around grief in order to be able to challenge some of those and do what we need to do in the process, in the journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So first I will just say her name is Kristen. So I know one of the big things we do in the grief world or one of the things people appreciate is their name, right? So oftentimes one of the other things is people get stuck in, people will forget blank, right? And I think that's valid because oftentimes people just don't always talk about the person who died. And yet when you think about it, like, we don't live our lives talking about our family members, our friends, our loved ones 24/7 either. Right. So that kind of nuance is like when they die, it's like, oh, someone has to like, and it's like, yes and no. Like, yes, it's great if people do. And I think that's depending on where you are. Like sometimes it's about communicating that, right? So as you know, Keith, he'll tell people a lot, especially in the panels that he runs for siblings, is that, we need to communicate more. And the same thing goes for when he does a panel for parents. He's like, everyone needs to communicate. Like, we can't not know what each other are thinking and how to support each other unless we have that communication. And then when it comes with our grief, sometimes we need to ask people to give us what we need. And people are like, I don't know what I need. Well, think about what you need and then ask for it. Or just ask for people to come visit, right? Because I think sometimes, depending on the loss, it's like, oh, people showed up for 2 weeks or a month and then everyone stopped coming. And that's the hard part, is because people have their own lives to live. And so they can't just drop everything for you. So it sucks when you lose that support. So how can you reframe, like, okay, people aren't reaching out anymore. Maybe I can reach out and say, hey, I'm having a bad day, or hey, can you come watch a movie with me? Or I don't want to talk, but I just want someone here. So figuring out ways that work for you, because it's kind of crappy to say that we have to figure out what we have to do for ourselves, but if we don't, then we're stuck in that, like, woe is me, and I feel so bad that I can't do anything. And so it's a mix, right? It's okay to be in that space, but staying stuck is something where you don't want to be necessarily.
Yes, and I think in regards to that whole communication piece, I think it's really critical, right? Because even in our journey of losing Stacy, I didn't know what your needs were, and you didn't know what my needs were, right? And so we didn't really talk about needs in general. It's not that we never did, though I think it's really important to be able to advocate for yourself, even in the grief process, because I don't know what any person needs. And sometimes I don't know what I need, and I agree. Then it might be helpful for me to sit and think about, what is it? And I have done that over the years, of saying, I don't need someone in my house. Like when she first died and people were staying at the house and I just needed space. And I just said, you all need to leave. That's what I need. I need you to leave and go home. Right? And it's hard to say that. It's hard to tell people those things because you're worried about hurting their feelings, when at the end of the day, you're just trying to take care of yourself in a very hard time in your life.
Yeah, spaces. I guess that's another interesting part of your needs and wants, and being able to recognize when it, quote unquote, becomes unhealthy, right? Because you could be like, I don't want anyone around. I don't want anyone around. Like, and are you intentionally or unknowingly pushing people away and avoiding the grief and avoiding the talking about it? Or are you able to kind of like integrate, like, because I think that's kind of what happens. We're forced to do it. Like when someone dies, you grieve, you don't grieve. In a sense, you kind of push it away so that you can go to your job, take care of your kids, take care of your responsibilities. If you take care of your parents, if you take care of someone else, right? You're doing all of these things. And then when you go home, you can have your time to grieve or not, because you're so tired that you don't grieve, but your body is in a depressed state, and kind of why I'll be like, oh, you're depressed. And it's like, actually, they're grieving. Like they could have both, but that could be another topic of getting assessed or like seeing a doctor and be like, oh, you're depressed. Let me give you some antidepressants or X, Y, and Z to make you feel better or to get you to normal. And it's like, well, they're grieving. And so, you're band-aiding the wrong thing. So I think it gets tricky. Cause like, as we said, like we're not taught how to grieve, even in the compassionate friends from my experience, I don't think they necessarily have like this topic where they're like communicate with people. It's more of a sitting in a circle, and depending on how many people you have, if you have a lot of people that go to a meeting, there's less time to talk if everyone's getting time to share. But if you're able to bring in the topics of, communicating or how to support your surviving child or things that help you, I don't know if there's a good word for this, like, or how to help you grow into your grief so that you're more in control versus having your grief be in control of you.
Okay. It makes me think about the CRS model, right? And how that plays into a lot of this and into the mental health challenges that people can experience when they're grieving. And I agree with you. That's a whole other topic in terms of, are they really depressed or are they grieving? And it can be a really fine line. So it's more about, are they grieving in a way that is helping them move through their grief, right? So it's more looking at that. And there are times when people need to isolate. I think isolation is not always a bad word. Sometimes people just need some downtime to just sit in it or sit in a different space with it, whatever that looks like, and be able to just feel what they need to feel, and then still be able to interact with others and take care of their responsibilities. And sometimes it's about, I'm going to change my responsibilities because it's too much for me to manage all of that with my grief. And I've seen people leave their jobs because they had high demanding jobs, and after a loss, just are not able to manage it. They couldn't tolerate the stress levels of that job anymore. So again, it's like, okay, so now what does life look like? What does your journey look like now? And just navigating it. So I think that people can have that downtime in that space alone. And it gives people an opportunity to just kind of process and think about and try to identify what their needs are and be able to communicate better with people when they have this space to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just like everything else in life. It's all tricky. Like, in some ways, there are no answers, right? Like parenting, grieving, substance use, mental health, depression. Like, everyone has their own story with it where things work for some people and they don't work for others.
Right.
And then it's like, well, why doesn't it? Because if it works for someone, then, shouldn't it work for other people?
Because we're unique individuals and we're human beings and we don't fit in boxes. So there you go. That's my answer to that one. I think that it's about trying different things if you find that something doesn't work for you. Same thing in therapy. You can try different modalities, and it doesn't mean that modality is going to work for every single person that comes your way. And so I think it's important to just know, what's available to you. And I know you had mentioned in the beginning talking about messaging and having to be over it and all of that. And I've worked with a few people in the recently who have had losses of spouses, and one of them said to me, I should be over it. I just wanted to get up out of my chair and shake her. And I said, it's really raw grief right now. It is not something that you get over. It is something that we can work through, and it will be a journey, right? So again, it's this thought process of, so the loss was at the end of May. It's been 2 months, right? And we can look at raw grief, at least in my experience and working with people in my own journey, of at least a year, if not longer. right? So the first year is so, it's like you're just feeling around in the dark, trying to figure out, because someone pulled the rug out from under you and you're just trying to understand what the heck just happened. And then in the second, and it's kind of like a fog state. You're just existing, you're just going through life and you're not present. And then in the second year, and this is what I've heard from a lot of people in my own experience, is the fog has lifted, and man, does it come hard for some people, right? And they're starting to really understand the depths of the grief that they have gone through in the last year. Not everyone's experience. I think it's different for everyone, and just trying to give yourself permission for time. And I always say, time does not heal all wounds. I do not believe that statement. I think time allows us space from the initial loss, and you will always miss. So it doesn't heal the wound. It just what's the word I want to use? It softens it, I guess is a good word that I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think a part of that is, if you talk about therapy, it's kind of like exposure and being desensitized to things. So the more you're in something, in theory, it lessens. And I think the other component is not necessarily time. Because if you think of time as an illusion, or time means nothing, it's not the length of time, it's what you do within the time.
Yes.
So, like you said, more times than not, early grief or new grief is sometimes seen as up to 2 years. So that is still, so someone's like, I'm only 18 months, like that's still new until you hit 2. And even if you hit 3, it's still new. Like if we looked at it as an infant, again, when you're 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, it's still new. Again, with time, what you do with that as the years go on, what you do with your grief, how you either honor it, how you stay stuck in it, how you move through it, will kind of, in some ways, have control over your life. Because if you don't do anything with your grief, it can show up more in getting sick, not feeling well, getting depressed, like
being angry.
Being angry. Yeah.
So the parent struggled with anger for many, many years after the loss of his son, and wasn't able to be present in life as a result of holding on to that anger.
What if he said, what was he angry at or with?
I don't know that he even recognized how present his anger was in his life.
Well,
people saw.
And I think that is also a point where hopefully, I don't know, well, even if it was with you, someone in their life where they have the ability to say, like, I see how angry you are. Even if you don't notice it, like, I see how angry you are, or, and giving the details, like, I see it in your face, I see it in your body language. Because I think that, my hope is with somatic breath work is that it helps people get an awareness of how they feel in their body. And when they have that awareness, it helps with like emotional intelligence. So it's like, I'm angry, I'm sad, and I notice this feeling. But if we don't work on those things, then how do we get better at it? And recognizing when we're stressed, when we're tense. Because some people can say like, oh, like, I don't know what's wrong with me. Nothing bad happened. It's not an anniversary. It's not a birthday. It's not the time that they died, but they're sick or they're anxious, or they're having like the chest hurts. And it's like sometimes that's either catch up. So something did happen in the past, or like, as some people say, moving away from, I guess, the T word and saying more of a reaction to something versus I know I'll just say it, a trigger, because like again, not everyone likes that word, and that word in and of itself could be what causes a reaction, depending if you get into the cause of death, of suicide or murder. And so when we're unaware of the things, maybe it happened a week ago, and then boop, 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 a week later, you're like having a panic attack. You're like, ah! It's like, if you recognize the original, like maybe it was just that, oh, I have a stomach ache, or like my gut hurts, or I have a headache, and it's like, I'll be fine.
Right. It's that. And so it's interesting when you said it's what you do at the time, right? And so it makes me think about this parent and think about the number of years focused just more on anger, right? And I don't know if anyone ever told him. I didn't have that kind of relationship with him to have that conversation, I guess, at the time. And was more of a mentor when I started my grief journey, sort of, right? Not really my mentor, but was a support in the grief world at the time. And so it made me think about my own anger when I was in therapy after Stacy died. And it was around 5 years out. And I remember telling my therapist, I just feel angry all the time. I'm angry. And she said, well, why do you think you're angry? I said, I don't know. I said to her, and I feel angry when I'm in the car. That's where I feel my anger the most. So she encouraged me to sit in my anger while I'm in the car. And I said, okay, I'll humor you and try it. That woman was my saving grace in where I am today. And so I was driving in the car one day and I felt angry, and I just sat with it as I'm driving and thinking about it and just going like, why are you so angry? And then it was like a light bulb, like someone literally flipped the switch, and I said, I'm angry because she's not here. And I'm angry in the car because we've had our best talks in the car. And once I recognized why I was angry, I did not feel anger. Not to that extent.
I mean,
because it was just living in my body for a long time.
Yeah. And I mean, that sounds more when people are able to reframe like what they're going through, like looking at it in a different lens of not that, I mean, you're not going to get the chance to talk with Stacy or necessarily have her talk back to us. But when it's a moment of like being able to like, cherish the moments of like, of those times when you were able to have those great talks with her in the car versus like being angry because you're never going to have that chance again. Like, and how each of those thoughts, like you can get stuck in that anger because you're like, I'm angry because of this, or I'm grateful because of this.
So I think it's helpful for people to put a name to something, right? To understand why. I think it's really important at least for me. If someone says you need to do these things, I want to know the why behind it. What is the impact? Like, that's just how my brain works. And so if someone says you just need to do it because I told you, it's like when we say to our kids, because I told you so. And parents get frustrated with their kids because they go, I don't need to give you an explanation. Well, sometimes that's the way people's brains work, is about, well, if I understand the reason for certain things, then it makes sense to them versus because I told you so, right? So I think for me, because I could figure out why I was angry, it allowed me to move out of that space of anger. And like you were saying, there'd be times I'd drive in the car and just put my hand on the seat as I was driving, just like as if she was still sitting there. So it shifted. There was a shift. And I think when we can name it and we can identify it, it helps us shift out of a space, if that makes sense. And the other thing I wanted to bring up that you were talking about communicating, right? So I'm at the conference and I'm having breakfast in the restaurant, and there was an older woman sitting in the table next to me, and we just started to chat. And she was a grandparent who lost a grandchild to suicide. And that's all she said. And we just talked, and it was her first conference. She went with her daughter and son-in-law, and they had been the year before. And so another person came over and started chatting with us and knew that we were with the group and sat down, and we were just talking and chatting and, just talking about, I lost my daughter, I lost my grandchild, those kinds of things. And then this mom says to the grandmother, so can you tell me how?
So depending on your intuition or maybe even your experiences in your own grief and loss, you might know exactly what this grieving mother is about to say to the grieving grandmother as she asks her, so can you tell me how, ... Stay tuned for part 2 to hear the rest of this conversation on grief and loss.